My life, for the better part of 3 years, had been a study in controlled observation. I lived within the quiet confines of the university library, my world circumscribed by the scent of aging paper and the low, deferential hum of scholarly pursuit. I was a graduate student in literature, a creature of footnotes and marginalia, more comfortable with the dead than the living. My emotional landscape was a flat, featureless plain, a place I navigated with a practiced, almost ascetic detachment. It was easier that way. Loneliness was a familiar ache, a dull thrum beneath the surface of my days, but it was a known quantity. It did not demand anything of me. The single point of intense, chaotic color in this grayscale existence was Professor Alastair Finch. He was my thesis advisor, a man whose intellect was as sharp and unforgiving as a shard of glass. He moved through the academic world with a quiet, unassailable confidence that I both envied and feared. For 2 years, I had sat in his seminars, my notebook filled with his pronouncements, my mind alight with the connections he drew between disparate texts. But my observation of him was never purely academic. It was a secret, obsessive cataloging of details. The way the silver at his temples caught the fluorescent light of the lecture hall. The low, resonant timbre of his voice that could make a line of obscure poetry sound like a confession. The precise, elegant movements of his hands as he gestured, tracing arguments in the air. This was not a crush, not in the simple, fleeting sense. It was a kind of intellectual worship that had metastasized into something deeper, more personal, and infinitely more hopeless. He was Professor Finch. I was Leo, one of a dozen anxious graduate students vying for his attention. The distance between us was not measured in feet, but in status, in age, in the entire architecture of the institution that defined our relationship. So I kept my vigil from a safe distance, my feelings relegated to the silent, unwritten pages of my own internal monologue. I was a passive observer of my own life, and he was the subject I could never truly apprehend. My thesis, a sprawling, ambitious attempt to trace a specific vein of melancholy through modernist poetry, had stalled. It was not writer's block, it was a conceptual collapse. The structure I had so carefully built had crumbled, leaving me with 100 pages of disconnected insights and a rising tide of panic. My funding was contingent on progress, and progress had ceased. I sat in his office, the late afternoon sun slanting through the dusty window, and confessed my failure. The words felt like stones in my mouth. He listened, his expression unreadable. This was his default state. His face was a study in subtle planes and shadows, rarely betraying any overt emotion. He steepled his long fingers, his gaze fixed on the manuscript I had pushed across his desk, a document that felt more like a testament to my own inadequacy than a piece of scholarship. The silence stretched, thick with my anxiety. I braced myself for the expected response. A list of suggested readings, a recommendation to narrow my focus, a professional but firm expression of disappointment. Instead, he leaned back in his leather chair, the old springs groaning in protest. "The problem, Leo," he said, his voice calm and even, "is not your research. It's your environment. You're trying to think in a vacuum." He gestured vaguely toward the window, at the manicured lawns of the campus. "This place is designed for instruction, not inspiration." I stared at him, unsure how to respond. He looked at me then, a direct, assessing gaze that always made me feel transparent. "My home office is quiet," he said, the offer dropping into the room with unexpected weight. "And I have a private library that contains several first editions that might be relevant. Things you won't find here." He paused, letting the silence build again. "Come over this Saturday. We'll spend the day on it. We'll break this deadlock." The world tilted slightly on its axis. My heart, a sluggish, reliable muscle, gave a painful lurch. It was a completely inappropriate suggestion. It blurred lines that were meant to be indelible. It was also the only lifeline I had been thrown in months. My mind raced, cataloging all the reasons to decline, all the potential pitfalls and professional dangers. But the part of me that had spent 2 years observing him from afar, the part that yearned for something beyond the sterile confines of my life, was already saying yes. "Okay," I heard myself say, the words sounding small and distant. "Yes, thank you, Professor Alastair," he corrected, a faint, almost imperceptible softening around his eyes. At my home, You can call me Alistair. And just like that, the controlled, predictable landscape of my life was fractured. A door had opened into a new, unmapped territory, and I had no choice but to step through it. His house was a modest brick colonial on a quiet, tree-lined street a few miles from campus. It was the kind of neighborhood where people raked their own leaves, and the silence on a Saturday morning was broken only by the distant whir of a lawnmower. I stood on his front porch for a full minute, my knuckles hovering over the doorbell, my bag of books and notes feeling like a sack of rocks. This was a mistake. I should turn around, feign a sudden illness, and retreat to the safety of the library. Before I could act on the impulse, the door swung open. It was him, Alistair, and the sight of him short-circuited every anxious thought in my brain. He was not Professor Finch, clad in the tweed jacket and pressed trousers that served as his campus uniform. He was a man in his own home, wearing a simple, dark gray Henley that clung to the lean muscles of his chest and shoulders, and a pair of faded jeans that looked soft and worn. His feet were bare. The ever-present academic formality had been stripped away, leaving something far more immediate and unsettlingly real. "Leo," he said, his voice that same low timbre, but without the lecture hall projection. It was softer, closer. "You're punctual. I appreciate that. Come in." He stepped back, and I entered a space that smelled of lemon polish, old books, and brewing coffee. The air was warm and still. I saw the silver at his temples, not as a sign of professorial age, but as a striking contrast to his dark hair. I saw the fine lines around his eyes, lines etched by thought and time, and perhaps, I imagined, by laughter. His gaze seemed different here, too. Less analytical, more present. It was the gaze of a host, not an advisor. It rested on me with a quiet intensity that made me intensely aware of my own awkwardness, of the way I clutched the strap of my bag like a shield. "Coffee?" he asked, already turning toward the kitchen. "Yes, please," I managed, my voice a little tight. I followed him, my eyes taking in the details of his home. It was neat, uncluttered, filled with books and art. It felt lived in, comfortable, a physical extension of the man himself. In the kitchen, he moved with an easy, unhurried grace, retrieving 2 ceramic mugs from a cabinet. I watched the muscles in his forearms flex as he poured the coffee. It was an ordinary action, something I had seen 1,000 times, but in this new context, it felt charged with a significance I couldn't begin to parse. He handed me a mug, his fingers brushing against mine. The contact was fleeting, a spark of warmth that shot up my arm. I flinched, almost dropping the mug, and a splash of hot coffee scalded my hand. "Careful," he said, his voice laced with a hint of amusement. He took a cloth from the counter and gently dabbed at my hand, his touch firm and surprisingly steady. "The study is this way. Let's get to work before you incapacitate yourself." His hand was on my back then, a brief, guiding pressure that steered me out of the kitchen and down a hallway. It was nothing, a simple gesture of direction, but it felt like everything. It was the first time he had touched me outside of a perfunctory handshake. The warmth of his palm lingered on my shirt long after he had moved away, a phantom sensation that marked the beginning of something I did not yet have a name for. His study was my version of paradise. Floor-to-ceiling bookshelves lined 3 of the 4 walls, crammed with volumes of every shape and size. A large mahogany desk sat before a wide window overlooking a lush, slightly overgrown garden. The room smelled powerfully of leather and paper, a scent I found more intoxicating than any perfume. In the corner, 2 worn leather armchairs were angled toward a small and used fireplace. It was a room built for thinking. "Make yourself comfortable," Alistair said, gesturing to the desk. "You take the main chair. I'll pull up another 1 inch." We settled in, the vast expanse of the desk between us. For the first hour, we worked. Or rather, I tried to work. My manuscript was open on my laptop, the cursor blinking on a sea of helpless text. But my focus was fractured. I was acutely, painfully aware of him sitting just a few feet away. I could hear the soft scratch of his fountain pen as he made notes on a printed copy of my chapter. I could hear the quiet, rhythmic sound of his breathing. The air in the room felt thick with his presence, charged with a low-level hum of energy that made it impossible for me to concentrate. I spent most of my time observing him under the pretense of deep thought. I watched the way his brow furrowed when he encountered a sentence he didn't like. I watched the almost imperceptible tick in his jaw when he was concentrating. He had pushed the sleeves of his Henley up to his elbows, and I found my gaze repeatedly drawn to the strong lines of his forearms, to the dark dusting of hair that tapered toward his wrists. He was a physical fact in a way he had never been in the sterile, intellectual space of the university. Here, he was not just a mind. He was a body, a presence that occupied space, that breathed, that had a scent. Cedarwood and something else. Bergamot, maybe. It was subtle, clean, and utterly distracting. "You're not writing," he stated, his voice cutting through my reverie. It was not an accusation, just a flat observation. I looked up, caught. My face flushed. "Sorry, I'm just trying to find a way in." He leaned forward, resting his elbows on the desk. "Leo, stop trying to write the perfect sentence. Just tell me, in your own words, what is the core argument of this chapter?" I stumbled through an explanation, my words tangled and imprecise. He listened patiently, his eyes never leaving my face. His focus was absolute, and I felt it like a physical touch. When I finished, he was silent for a moment. "You're thinking of it as a linear progression," he said finally. "But the poets you're analyzing weren't linear. Their sense of loss was cyclical, a recurring echo. You need to structure the chapter like that, not as a line, but as a spiral." He stood up and came around the desk to stand behind me. My entire body went rigid. He was so close I could feel the warmth radiating from him. He leaned over my shoulder, his hand coming to rest on the back of my chair, his fingers just inches from my neck. He used his other hand to point at a paragraph on my screen. "This part here," he said, his voice low and close to my ear. "This is your center. Everything else should radiate out from it, and then circle back to it." His breath stirred the hair at my temple. The scent of him, cedar, bergamot, clean cotton, filled my senses. I couldn't process a single word he was saying about my thesis. My entire consciousness had narrowed to the point of his proximity. The heat of his body, the sound of his voice in my ear, the sheer overwhelming fact of him standing so near. My heart was a frantic drum against my ribs. "I am here. He is here. This is happening." He must have felt the tension coiling in my shoulders, because he straightened up, breaking the contact. He moved back to his side of the desk, his expression once again unreadable. "Just a thought," he said, his tone carefully neutral. But the neutrality was a lie. Something had shifted in the room. The air was different now, heavier. The professional distance we had been maintaining had been breached, however briefly, and we both knew it. I stared at my screen, the words blurred and meaningless. The blinking cursor felt like a mocking heartbeat, counting down the seconds in this strange, new reality. My internal monologue, usually a constant stream of academic analysis and self-criticism, was now a chaotic mess of questions. Did he do that on purpose? Did he lean in that close just to make a point about my paper? Or was there something else? Was the hand on my chair a simple, unconscious gesture, or was it a test? A signal? I replayed the moment again and again, dissecting every detail. The warmth of his breath, the low rumble of his voice, the way my own body had responded with an immediate, involuntary jolt of longing. I was overthinking it. Of course I was. That was my nature. I took ambiguous data and spun it into elaborate, unsupported theories. It was what made me a decent literary critic and a complete failure at navigating actual human interaction. He was my professor. He was trying to help me. That was all. To imagine anything else was a dangerous, self-indulgent fantasy. I forced myself to focus, to type, to rearrange the sentences on the screen according to his spiral theory. The work was a refuge, a way to impose order on the chaos in my mind. For the next few hours, we fell into a productive rhythm. We debated word choices, traced thematic threads, and restructured paragraphs. He was a brilliant editor, his insights sharp and incisive. He pushed me, challenged me, and under his guidance, the chapter began to take on a new, more coherent shape. The afternoon light softened, turning the dust motes dancing in the air to gold. My initial anxiety had subsided, replaced by a strange, humming energy. This was what I had always imagined intellectual companionship would feel like. A shared purpose, a meeting of minds. But beneath it, the other current still flowed, the unspoken awareness of our physical presence in this quiet, intimate space. Every so often, our eyes would meet across the desk, and the connection would feel like more than just a shared thought. It felt personal, a lingering look that held for a fraction of a second too long. A small, private smile he gave me when I made a particularly sharp observation. These were tiny, almost imperceptible moments, but my hyper-observant mind collected and cataloged each one, searching for a pattern, for meaning. Around 5 o'clock, he stood and stretched, his back arching. The simple movement pulled his Henley taut across his chest, and I quickly looked away, my face growing warm. "I think that's enough for one day," he said. "We've made good progress. My brain is starting to melt. How about a break? I was going to grill some steaks for dinner. You should stay." Again, the unexpected offer. Again, the blurring of lines. A full day of work was one thing. Sharing a meal felt different. More intimate. More personal. All the professional alarms in my head were screaming. But the yearning part of me, the lonely part, was so much louder. "I don't want to impose," I said, the protest weak and insincere. "It's not an imposition, Leo. It's an invitation." He was watching me, his expression open, waiting. The choice was mine. "Okay," I said, my voice quiet. "I'd like that." We moved from the study to the kitchen, and the dynamic shifted again. Here, he was completely at ease. He opened a bottle of red wine, handing me a glass. He moved around the small space with an economy of motion, gathering spices, trimming vegetables. I leaned against the counter, feeling useless and out of place, and just watched him. "You can make the salad, if you want to feel useful," he said, a teasing note in his voice. He pushed a bowl and a head of lettuce toward me. So I washed lettuce and chopped tomatoes, the simple, domestic task feeling surreal. We talked as we worked, our conversation drifting away from my thesis. He asked me about my family, where I grew up. I learned that he had been raised in Oregon, that his father was a carpenter, that he was the first person in his family to go to college. These small biographical details felt like gifts, glimpses into the man behind the professor. He lit the grill on the small stone patio behind his house. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the lawn. The air was cool and smelled of charcoal and damp earth. We sat in a pair of weathered Adirondack chairs, sipping our wine, the silence between us comfortable now, companionable. As he was getting up to check the steaks, his hand brushed my knee. It was almost certainly an accident, a consequence of the close quarters of the chairs. But his fingers seemed to linger for a moment, a brief, warm pressure against the denim of my jeans. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. He didn't say anything, didn't acknowledge it. He just moved to the grill, his back to me. I stared at my wine glass, my heart hammering. It was a Rorschach test, a meaningless, accidental touch that my desperate mind was trying to shape into something more. Or it was a deliberate, subtle gesture, a way of testing the waters, of sending a signal without words. There was no way to know. The ambiguity was excruciating. We ate dinner at the small table in his kitchen. The steak was perfect, the wine was good, and the conversation flowed easily. He was witty and engaging, drawing me out, making me laugh. For the first time, I felt like I was talking to a person, not a professor. I felt seen. When it was time for me to leave, the awkwardness returned. We stood at the front door, the space between us suddenly charged again. "Thank you, Alistair," I said, clutching my bag. "For everything. The help with the paper, the dinner." "You're welcome, Leo." He was leaning against the doorframe, his arms crossed over his chest. His posture was casual, but his eyes were intent. "Same time next Saturday?" "Yes, absolutely." He reached out and placed his hand on my shoulder. It was not a pat, but a steady, grounding pressure. His thumb brushed against the side of my neck, a small, electrifying movement. "Good," he said, his voice a low murmur. "Drive safe." He held my gaze for another long moment before stepping back and closing the door. I walked to my car in a daze. My shoulder, my neck, the back of my hand, my knee, every point of contact tingled with a phantom warmth. The lines were not just blurred anymore. They felt like they were being deliberately, systematically erased. And I found that I wasn't scared. I was hopeful. The Saturdays became our ritual. Each week, I would arrive at his house at 10 in the morning, and each week, I would leave late in the evening after we had shared a meal. My thesis was transformed. Under his guidance, it found its voice, its structure, its argument. But the work itself felt increasingly like a pretext, an excuse for us to be in this quiet, private world we had created. The small, ambiguous touches continued, becoming a silent language we shared. A hand lingering on my arm as he passed me a book, his knee brushing against mine under the desk. One afternoon, as I was struggling with a particularly convoluted sentence, I ran a frustrated hand through my hair. He reached across the desk, without a word, and gently tucked a stray lock behind my ear. His fingers were warm against my skin, his touch so unexpectedly tender that it stole my breath. I looked up at him, my eyes wide, and for a fleeting second, I saw something in his expression, a flicker of vulnerability, of something that looked suspiciously like longing, before his mask of unreadability slipped back into place. He never mentioned these moments. Neither did I. They existed in the charged space between us, unspoken and unacknowledged, yet they built upon each other, week by week, ratcheting up the tension until the air in his study felt thick enough to suffocate me. My internal monologue was a constant, feverish analysis. Each touch, each lingering glance, was a piece of evidence to be weighed and considered. The prosecution argued for wishful thinking, for the desperate projections of a lonely student. The defense argued for a pattern, for a deliberate, cautious courtship conducted through a language of subtext and gesture. I was the judge and jury, and I was hopelessly deadlocked. One Saturday in late October, the weather turned. A cold, driving rain began to fall in the afternoon, lashing against the windows of the study. The sky grew dark, the world outside dissolving into a gray blur. The storm seemed to mirror the turbulence inside me. The steady rhythm of the rain was a counterpoint to the frantic, irregular beating of my own heart. Around 6, the lights flickered once, twice, and then went out. We were plunged into a sudden, disorienting darkness, the only light coming from the faint, ghostly glow of our laptop screens. "Well?" Alistair's voice came out of the blackness, calm and amused. "That's not ideal." I heard the scrape of his chair, the soft tread of his footsteps. A moment later, a match flared, and he lit a thick candle on the corner of the desk. The small flame pushed back the darkness, casting long, dancing shadows on the walls. He lit a few more, placing them around the room, until we were cocooned in a warm, flickering glow. The effect was immediate and profound. The last vestiges of formality, the pretense of our student-teacher relationship, seemed to dissolve in the soft, intimate light. We were just two people, trapped in a house by a storm. "I suppose the work portion of our day is over," he said, settling back into his chair. He had a bottle of whiskey and 2 glasses in his hands. He poured a generous measure into each and pushed one across the desk to me. "To the limitations of the municipal power grid," he said, raising his glass. "To the power grid," I echoed, my voice a little shaky. The whiskey was smoky and warm, and it sent a pleasant heat spreading through my chest. We sat in silence for a while, listening to the rain drumming on the roof. The laptop screens, with my thesis glowing on them, seemed like artifacts from another world. They had no place here, in this candlelit intimacy. "Tell me something, Leo," Alistair said, his voice soft in the quiet room. "What do you actually want? After all this is done, after the degree, the defense, what does your life look like?" The question was so direct, so personal, it caught me off guard. No one had ever asked me that. My entire life had been a series of academic hurdles to clear. I had never allowed myself to think about what came after. "I don't know," I admitted, the confession feeling raw and vulnerable. "I guess I've always assumed I'd just keep doing this. Find a teaching position somewhere. Keep reading books and writing papers. Hiding in a library." Hiding, he picked up on the word, his gaze sharp even in the dim light. I took a sip of whiskey, the alcohol giving me a strange, uncharacteristic courage. "It's safe," I said. "In books. The emotional stakes are all secondhand. You can observe it all without having to risk anything yourself." He nodded slowly, his eyes thoughtful. He seemed to understand exactly what I meant. "I did that for a long time," he said, his voice dropping even lower. "After my marriage ended, I buried myself in my work. The university was a fortress. It's easy to confuse intellectual rigor with emotional honesty." I stared at him. I had known he was divorced. It was a piece of public academic gossip, but I had never imagined he would speak of it to me. The fortress wall he kept around himself seemed to be crumbling, brick by brick, in the flickering candlelight. He was showing me a part of himself he kept hidden, a moment of unexpected softness and vulnerability. "It's a lonely way to live," he added, his gaze holding mine. It wasn't a question. It was a statement of shared experience. "Yes," I whispered. "It is." The space between us crackled with everything that had gone unsaid for weeks. The storm outside raged, but in the small, warm circle of our candlelight, there was a profound and terrifying stillness. He was no longer my professor. I was no longer his student. We were two men, acknowledging a shared loneliness, a shared desire for something more than the safe, sterile worlds we had built for ourselves. The breakthrough had come, not in my thesis, but in this quiet, unguarded moment. And I knew, with a certainty that was both exhilarating and frightening, that nothing would ever be the same again. The power remained off. The storm settled into a steady, percussive rhythm against the roof and windows, isolating us completely from the outside world. The whiskey had warmed me from the inside out, loosening the tight coil of anxiety in my gut and replacing it with a slow, simmering heat. We abandoned the study and moved to the two leather armchairs by the cold fireplace, the candles casting our shadows long and distorted against the book-lined walls. Alistair refilled our glasses. The conversation we had started in the study continued, but it deepened, growing more personal with each passing hour. He spoke of his ex-wife, not with bitterness, but with a kind of weary sadness, describing their slow, quiet drift into becoming strangers who shared a house. He talked about the pressure to follow a conventional path, the life he thought he was supposed to want, and the quiet relief, mingled with guilt, that he felt when it was over. I found myself speaking with a candor I rarely allowed myself. I talked about my quiet, solitary childhood, my feeling of always being an observer on the sidelines of life. I spoke of my passion for poetry as a way to access emotions I was too afraid to feel myself. I didn't mention him, not directly, but he was the subtext of everything I said, the embodiment of the connection I craved but had always believed was unattainable. At some point, the conversation lulled, and we fell into a comfortable silence. The only sounds were the rain and the soft hiss and pop of the candle wicks. I watched him, his face illuminated by the warm, unsteady light. The shadows carved new depths into the planes of his face, making him look both older and more vulnerable. He was staring into the empty fireplace, his expression lost in thought. My thesis, my academic career, the entire formal structure of our relationship felt like a distant memory. All that existed was this room, this storm, this man. The tension that had been building for weeks had not dissipated, it had transformed. It was no longer a source of anxiety, but a palpable, living thing in the air between us, a shared current of awareness. My final defense was scheduled for the following Friday. My thesis was complete, a polished, coherent document that I was genuinely proud of. The last Saturday we were supposed to spend working felt different. The pretext was gone. We both knew why I was there. We sat in the study, the manuscript lying closed on the desk between us, a finished object. The silence was thick with anticipation. I was staring at the cover page, my name printed below the title, with his name listed below mine as my advisor. It felt like a lie, a misrepresentation of the intimate, complex relationship that had developed between these four walls. I was lost in my thoughts, tracing the letters of his name with my eyes, when I became aware of him moving. He came to stand behind my chair, just as he had done on that first day. My body tensed in anticipation, a Pavlovian response to his proximity. He placed his hands on my shoulders, his grip firm and warm. This was different. This was not a casual touch. It was deliberate, possessive. "You did it, Leo," he said, his voice a low rumble just behind my ear. "It's a brilliant piece of work." I couldn't speak. I could only feel the weight of his hands, the heat of them seeping through my shirt, spreading down my arms and into my chest. He didn't move away. He just stood there, his hands resting on my shoulders, his body a warm, solid presence behind me. I could feel his chest against my back as he breathed. The scent of him, that familiar mix of cedar and bergamot, enveloped me. The tension was a physical thing, a high-frequency wire humming between us. It was unbearable. It was perfect. He leaned down, his lips brushing the shell of my ear as he spoke, his voice barely a whisper. But that's not why you're here today, is it? My breath hitched. My heart felt like it was going to beat its way out of my chest. The world narrowed to the feeling of his mouth so close to my skin, the implication of his words hanging in the air. He straightened up slightly, but his hands remained on my shoulders. The silence stretched, taut and fragile. This was it. The tipping point. The moment where the subtext finally had to break the surface. He asked the question, his voice quiet but clear, each word precise and weighted. Leo, is this helping? Or is it making things more difficult? The question was a key, turning a lock deep inside me. He wasn't talking about the thesis. He was talking about us. About these Saturdays, about the lingering touches, the shared glances, the candlelit confessions. He was asking me to name the thing that had grown between us, to give it form, to make it real. I am frozen. Time stretches, thins out, becomes a fragile filament. My mind, usually a raging torrent of analysis and second-guessing, is utterly silent. There is only the feeling of his hands on my shoulders, a grounding, terrifying pressure. The question hangs in the air, not an academic query demanding a clever response, but a simple, profound appeal. Helping or more difficult. It's a binary choice, and yet it contains the entire universe of my unspoken longing. Slowly, as if moving through water, I turn in my chair. I have to face him. I can't answer a question like that to the empty air. My knees bump against his legs. We are so close. I lift my head and meet his eyes. His expression is stripped of all its usual defenses. There is no professorial distance, no unreadable mask. There is only a raw, searching intensity. He is waiting. He is risking something, too. The words feel inadequate, small, but they are the only honest ones I have. More difficult, I whisper. My voice is a thread, easily broken, but it carries the weight of months of silent observation, of frantic hope. The admission is a surrender. It is me laying down my arms, abandoning the fortress of academic detachment I had hidden behind for so long. I watch his face, bracing for the retreat, for the professional wall to slam back into place. I expect him to take a step back, to clear his throat, to turn this back into a misunderstanding. He does not. Instead, the tension in his face dissolves. A slow, profound relief softens his features. A breath he seemed to have been holding for a very long time escapes his lips in a quiet sigh. His hands slide from my shoulders, one moving to the back of my neck, his fingers tangling in my hair, the other coming up to cup my jaw. His thumb strokes the line of my cheekbone, a gesture of such exquisite tenderness it makes my eyes burn. For me, too, he says, his voice thick with an emotion I can't quite name. And there it is, the confession, the reciprocal truth that I had only ever dared to dream of. The dam of my carefully constructed composure breaks, and a wave of pure, unadulterated feeling washes over me. Relief so potent it feels like a physical release, joy so sharp it borders on pain. He leans in, his gaze dropping to my lips. He is not rushing. He is giving me time to pull away, to stop this. He is giving me the choice I never thought I would have. I don't move. I can't. I lean into his touch, my eyes fluttering closed. The first touch of his lips is soft, questioning. It is not a kiss of passion, but of discovery. It is slow, deliberate, a conversation without words. It tastes of whiskey and coffee and something that is uniquely, intoxicatingly him. It speaks of loneliness and patience and a shared, secret wanting. This is not a performance. This is not a mistake. It feels like a homecoming. He deepens the kiss, and I respond, my hands coming up to grip his shirt, pulling him closer. The gentle discovery ignites into a fire that has been banked for far too long. All the unspoken tension, all the longing glances and accidental touches find their release in this one, desperate, honest connection. It is not rushed, but it is hungry. It is the consummation of 1,000 silent conversations. He breaks the kiss, but only to rest his forehead against mine. We are both breathing heavily, the sound loud in the quiet study. His eyes, when they open, are dark and intense. Leo, he breathes my name, and it sounds like a prayer. He straightens up, his hands still framing my face, and gently pulls me to my feet. I am unsteady, my legs weak. He doesn't let go of me. He keeps one hand on my jaw, his thumb stroking my skin, and with the other, he slowly, deliberately, sweeps the closed manuscript and my laptop to the side of the desk. The sound of the items sliding across the polished wood is the only sound in the room. He turns me then, gently, so that my back is to him, and guides me to lean forward over the desk, my hands resting on the cool, solid wood. The pose is one of surrender, of trust. It mirrors the title of a fantasy I never would have admitted to, but this reality is nothing like the crude simplicity of a headline. This is not about power. It is about the relinquishing of it, mutually. He presses against me from behind, his body a warm, solid line against my back. He is not rough. He is worshipful. His arms wrap around me, his hands splaying across my stomach, pulling me back against him. He buries his face in the crook of my neck, his breath hot against my skin. "I have wanted this," he murmurs, his voice a vibration that travels through my entire body, "for longer than you can imagine." His words undo me. The last of my fear, my doubt, evaporates. There is only this, the solid weight of his body against mine, the scent of him, the heat of him. His hands begin to move, not with urgent haste, but with a slow, exploratory reverence. He unbuttons my shirt, his fingers deft and sure, pushing the fabric aside. His lips follow the path his hands have cleared, pressing soft, open-mouthed kisses against my shoulder blades, the sensitive skin of my spine. Each touch is a revelation, a brand of possession that feels like a gift. I arch back into him, my head falling back against his shoulder, giving him better access. A low sound escapes my throat, a mix of a gasp and a moan. It is the sound of years of repression unraveling. The work we are doing now has nothing to do with poetry or prose. It is a more fundamental text, written in the language of skin and breath and the silent, desperate beating of two hearts that have finally found the same rhythm. We are bent over the desk, and we are finally, truly, getting to work. I woke to the unfamiliar gray light of dawn filtering through the slats of Venetian blinds. For a moment, I was adrift, my mind a blank slate, before the memories of the previous night came rushing back in a tidal wave of heat and sensation. I was in Alistair's guest room, tucked into a bed with crisp, cool sheets that smelled faintly of him. I had a vague recollection of him leading me here, of a final, lingering kiss at the door, his quiet insistence that I stay, that it was too late and the roads were too slick with rain. Panic, cold and sharp, pierced through the warm haze of memory. I sat bolt upright. The house was utterly silent. Too silent. My clothes were folded neatly on a chair beside the bed. I dressed with frantic, clumsy haste, my fingers fumbling with the buttons of my shirt. What had I done? This was my professor, my thesis advisor. I had shattered every conceivable professional boundary. The intimacy that had felt so right, so inevitable in the candlelit study, now seemed like a catastrophic lapse in judgment in the harsh, unforgiving light of morning. He would regret it. Of course, he would. He would be downstairs right now, pacing his kitchen, consumed with professional shame, figuring out the kindest way to tell me that it was a mistake, a consequence of whiskey and a power outage. The thought was a physical blow, knocking the air from my lungs. I had to leave. I had to get out before he woke up, before we had to have the awkward, excruciating conversation that would surely follow. I could email him later, apologize, and we could pretend it never happened. I crept out of the room, my socked feet making no sound on the polished hardwood floors. The hallway was dim, the house still asleep. I made my way toward the front door, my heart a frantic, trapped bird in my chest. Just as my hand reached for the doorknob, a voice from the kitchen stopped me cold. "Leo?" I froze, my back to him. I couldn't turn around. I couldn't face the pity, the regret, in his eyes. "I was just making coffee," Alistair said, his voice quiet, even. There was no discernible emotion in it, which only made my anxiety spike higher. Slowly, I forced myself to turn. He was standing in the doorway of the kitchen, holding two mugs. He was wearing the same jeans from yesterday, but had pulled on a soft, dark sweater. His hair was tousled from sleep, and his face was etched with fatigue, but his eyes were clear, his gaze steady. He looked calm. He walked toward me, not stopping until he was only a foot away. He extended one of the mugs to me. My hand was shaking as I took it. Our fingers brushed, and the small, familiar spark of contact shot up my arm. I stared down into the black coffee, unable to meet his eyes. I didn't sleep much, he said, his voice a low murmur. Here it comes, I thought. The regret. I braced myself. Not because I regretted it, he continued, as if reading my mind. Because for the first time in a long time, I didn't want to. I didn't want to miss a moment of it. I looked up at him then, my eyes wide with disbelief. He wasn't looking away. His gaze was direct, honest, and filled with a warmth that seemed to push back the cold panic inside me. He reached out with his free hand and gently took mine. His fingers laced with mine, his grip firm and reassuring. I woke up feeling safe, he said, the admission soft, almost a whisper. I haven't felt that in years. The simple, quiet reassurance was more powerful than any grand declaration. It settled the frantic bird in my chest. The fear receded, replaced by a fragile, tentative hope. He wasn't pushing me away. He was pulling me closer. He lifted our joined hands and pressed a soft kiss to my knuckles, his eyes never leaving mine. The morning after unease, the awkwardness I had dreaded, vanished as if it had never been there. There was no regret in this room. There was only the quiet, steady promise of a new beginning, held in the warmth of his hand, in the taste of fresh coffee, in the silent, shared understanding that passed between us in the pale morning light. The return to campus on Monday was a lesson in cognitive dissonance. The university, which had once been the entire universe to me, now felt like a stage set, flimsy and artificial. The familiar hallways and lecture halls were imbued with a new, secret significance. Every corner held a memory of a conversation. Every glance from a fellow student felt like a potential accusation. The greatest test was walking into Alistair's office for our pre-defense meeting. The space was identical to how it had always been. The scent of old books, the cluttered desk, the shaft of dusty sunlight. But we were different. The air between us was charged with the memory of his study, of candlelight, of skin against skin. The power dynamic that had defined our relationship for so long was still officially in place. He was Professor Finch, and I was his student. The knowledge of what had happened, of who we were to each other in the privacy of his home, felt like a dangerous, exhilarating secret. He was behind his desk, all business, his expression professionally neutral. "Good morning, Leo," he said, his tone formal. For a terrifying moment, I thought he was going to pretend nothing had happened, that the man who had held me in his arms was gone, replaced by the professor. But then I saw it. As I sat down in the chair opposite him, his foot moved under the desk, his shoe gently, deliberately, pressing against mine. It was a small, hidden gesture, a secret message passed between us in the formal, public space. I looked up at him, and his eyes met mine. He gave me a tiny, almost imperceptible wink. My anxiety melted away, replaced by a giddy, conspiratorial warmth. This was a new kind of game, a new kind of tension, navigating the public world while nurturing our private one. The fear of judgment, of what this could mean for his career and my degree, was still there, a low hum in the back of my mind. But it was overshadowed by the thrill of our shared secret, of the silent, reassuring pressure of his foot against mine. This was the test, and I realized, with a surge of confidence, that it was a test we would pass together. My thesis defense was an out-of-body experience. I presented my research to a committee of 3 professors, Alistair among them, my voice steady and confident. I answered their questions with a clarity and precision that surprised even me. I felt Alistair's presence in the room not as a source of pressure, but as a silent, grounding force. I was no longer the anxious, insecure student desperate for his approval. I was his equal, a scholar presenting my work, and the knowledge of the deeper, more profound equality we shared gave me a strength I had never possessed before. When it was over, they asked me to step outside while they deliberated. I waited in the empty hallway, my hands trembling slightly, the adrenaline of the past 2 hours slowly draining away. The door opened, and the committee chair smiled at me. "Congratulations, doctor," she said. "You passed with distinction." Relief washed over me, so potent it made me dizzy. I had done it. It was over. The final academic hurdle had been cleared. I was no longer a student. That evening, there was a knock on the door of my small, cluttered apartment. It was Alistair. He was holding a bottle of expensive champagne. He looked different, standing on my doorstep. He was not my professor, not my advisor. The last vestige of that formal relationship had been officially dissolved. "I believe congratulations are in order," he said, a genuine, unguarded smile transforming his face. I let him in, and he looked around my tiny living room, a space dominated by precariously stacked towers of books. He took it all in: the worn-out armchair, the cheap prints on the wall, the organized chaos of my life. His presence seemed to fill the small space, making it feel less like a temporary student rental and more like a home. He popped the cork on the champagne, and we toasted to my success. We stood by the window, looking out at the city lights, the celebratory mood warm and easy between us. After a while, he set his glass down and turned to face me, his expression growing serious. "Leo," he began, his voice quiet, "I want to be in this life. In this room, with all these books." He gestured around the apartment. "If you'll have me, not as your professor, not as your advisor, just as Alistair." It was a conscious choice, a deliberate declaration made at the precise moment we became true equals. He was not offering me a relationship born of a power imbalance or a temporary, shared project. He was offering me a future, a partnership. He was choosing me, my messy apartment, my book-filled life. Tears pricked my eyes. "Yes," I said, my voice thick with emotion. "Yes, of course yes." He closed the distance between us and kissed me, and this kiss was different from all the others. It was not filled with the frantic energy of discovery or the heat of pent-up longing. It was calm, steady, and deeply reassuring. It was a kiss that felt like a promise, a commitment made not in the heat of the moment, but with the clear-eyed certainty of two people who had finally found their way to each other. It was the beginning of our real story. A few weeks later, I was packing up my apartment, preparing to move. Not into Alistair's house, not yet. We had decided to find a new place, a space that was ours, that didn't carry the history of our former roles. But for now, I was spending most of my time at his house, the place that had once been a site of such intense anxiety and longing, and was now simply home. One Sunday morning, we were sitting on his back patio, the one where he had first brushed his hand against my knee. The early morning sun was warm on our faces. We were drinking coffee, wrapped in blankets against the autumn chill, reading our respective books. There was no need to talk. The silence between us was a comfortable, living thing, filled with a sense of shared peace. I looked at him over the rim of my mug. He was completely absorbed in his book, a small, contented smile playing on his lips. The sight of him, so relaxed and at ease, filled me with a quiet, profound joy. This was the life I had never dared to imagine for myself. This quiet intimacy, this simple, domestic peace. He must have felt me watching him, because he looked up, his eyes meeting mine. He didn't say anything. He just reached out and took my hand, his fingers lacing with mine, his thumb stroking the back of my hand. It was a simple, familiar gesture, but it contained everything: the memory of our journey, the comfort of our present, the promise of our future. I leaned my head on his shoulder, the wool of his sweater soft against my cheek. I closed my eyes, breathing in the scent of him, of coffee, of the crisp morning air. The frantic, analytical voice in my head, the one that had narrated my lonely life for so long, was finally silent. It had been replaced by a feeling, a deep and abiding sense of rightness. I thought about the man I was just a few months ago, the lonely student who had worshipped a professor from afar, who had believed that love and connection were things that happened in books, not in real life. I had been an observer, afraid to participate in my own story. Alistair had not just been the subject of my observation. He had been the catalyst who had drawn me out from behind the glass, who had taught me that vulnerability was not a weakness, but a strength. The greatest thesis I had ever written wasn't the one bound and sitting on a shelf in the university library. It was this slow, careful, terrifying, and beautiful discovery of another person, of myself. It was learning to trust, to risk, to love. Sitting here, with his hand in mine, the sun on my face, I felt a sense of peace I had never known. I was no longer hiding. I was no longer alone. I had come home.